Hello and welcome to this Boris Spassky video. If you're not familiar with who Boris Spassky is, he was most famous for playing and losing against Bobby Fischer in the 1972 World Chess Championship. And Boris Spassky was an amazing universal player. He died recently. He lived to 88 years old. He was born in 1937 in Leningrad, Russia, and he died February 27th, 2025. So today I'm going to go over a game that he played against Fischer in that 1972 World Championship. Spoiler, I picked a game where Spassky won, so we can see what a great universal player Spassky was. And let's take a look at this game. Let's see here. Here we go. All right, so here you can see the end, but let's start from the beginning, and we'll turn on the computer and get a little bit of computer assistance. Spassky played with 95.8% accuracy rating in this game versus 91.3 by Fischer. So this will be a pretty amazing game. It looks like it was even for the first half of the game, and then Spassky obtained a slight advantage before building on that. And Spassky played at the equivalent of a 2850 rating level versus 2800 by Fischer. So let's take a look at this. Now, before I do, I'll turn on the computer. The game begins with Spassky playing d4 here. And now we have knight to f6. Fischer often played knight to f6 against d4. A lot of times he would play the king's Indian defense. And so here, Spassky just throws another pawn into the center. And this is something a little bit different a little bit different from what Fischer normally plays. He plays e6 here. Maybe going into a Nimzo Indian. So now we have knight to f3, just a normal developing move. Apparently, this is the anti-Nimzo Indian variation. And Fischer fights for control of the center here. He gains a little bit of space. And Spassky responds by just developing the other knight. So it's kind of transposed, according to the computer here, into an English type opening, but I don't know. This is kind of like a Queen's Gambit declined. Let's see what Fischer does. He pins the knight here. Okay, so we've transposed into the Queen's Gambit declined, the Rogozin defense. So this is a little bit different. A lot of times the bishop will go to e7. The other knight comes out. But Fischer, more of an attacking player, he decides to pin this knight to the king. So now we have a normal developing move by Boris Spassky. He pushes the pawn, allowing his bishop to cover this pawn in case it's captured. So the game continues with castling. The bishop is developed, and a lot of times when that bishop develops here, the pawn will capture then, forcing that bishop to move again. But Fischer, he just pushes his c-pawn, attacking this valuable central pawn on d4. So already we have a lot of action going on here. The pawns are confronting one another, and the bishop attacks the knight, pinning it to the king. So Spassky breaks, he gets out of that pin, castling his king to safety. And so now the knight jumps forward and develops. Game continues with a3, putting the question to this bishop. What should be played here? If you want to keep the bishop pair, you could retreat, or you just capture and double the pawns up here. So Fischer decides to keep the bishop pair. And now this pawn is no longer protected. So this is the first inaccuracy of the game. Spassky decides to drop back with this knight. And now we've transposed into a Nimzo-Indian defense, Gligorich-Bernstein defense in that Nimzo-Indian. So a lot of transpositions going on here, which you see at the top levels of chess, where the two chess masters go into one opening and they try and weave their way back and forth into different openings to see if they can catch their opponent off guard. So after this retreat, the computer actually prefers capturing in the center here with c takes d5. But now this gives Fischer the opportunity to attack the pawn. We have a recapture with the bishop. And Fischer drops his bishop back to cover this unprotected pawn here. So capture, queens are exchanged. And now we have an attack on the queen side of this bishop. So Fischer retreats back, and then Spassky develops his own bishop on the long diagonal, covering squares in the center and aiming up at Fischer's king side. So bishop develops, and the rook centralizes here, grabbing the open file. So we see there will probably be a battle here waged on these two open files. Spassky already has his rooks lined up on these open files. So Fischer decides to centralize his rook, fighting for the D file. And let's see how it continues. Knight jumps forward, attacking, targeting this knight. Will Fischer capture? Yes, we have a capture. And if we go back, that's another inaccuracy according to the computer. But, if you use a computer to, analyze and review games, just remember, it's like 0.15 difference. And unless it's like 3/4 of a pawn, 0.75, that difference, maybe at this level with the best players in the world, that could make a difference. But for average players, especially 0.15, that's basically even. So Fischer captures. We have a recapture, and now bishop attacks the rook. So we have a blocking move here and more exchanges. So now we're trading way down here. That's starting to go deep into the end game. Rook grabs the open file. So now we have the king marching towards the center. Now, you usually want to place your rooks on an open file, but if you can't penetrate into the position, then that file is not as strong. Fischer could go here, but then rook could block. If it's captured, the knight would recapture. So let's see what happens. Fischer, wants to keep that rook on the board. He centralizes his king, and that's very important in the endgame. You have to get those kings into the action, especially when there's only a few pieces left on the board. So Spassky brings his king up. Fischer decides to launch his knight forward. There is the threat here of forking king and rook, and that would force the bishop to capture. Rook would capture, attacking the knight here, and then if that knight moves, we could have a capture of the pawn here. So, that threat is avoided. The rooks could be traded off here. So, of course, Fischer trades down even further. And now we have bishop and knight versus bishop and knight. The position is pretty symmetrical, so it's kind of looking, pretty drawish here. So the game continues with knight attacking the pawn. Fischer drops back to defend. and the king is moving further up the board. So that could be an advantage here for Spassky. Fischer drops back, attacking the knight, threatening to capture and double pawns up here. So we have the knight dropping back, tempting a further exchange. Will Fischer do it? No. He defends, but now Spassky has the option to capture if he would like to. Capture, and now the pawn is pushing further up the board. Let's see what Spassky has in mind. Fischer captures here. Okay, this was a famous move in that World Championship game because this is an inaccuracy. We see that, but there's the chance of pushing this pawn and trapping the bishop over here. You know, and if the bishop tries to move here and attack this, well, then the king can just march over, protecting that. So a lot of people were wondering, you know, what was Fischer thinking? And he was asked about this move and basically stated that he didn't want to go into a draw, and he was thinking that he would just play and avoid a draw, which, you know, it looked like Spassky was just playing for the draw. So sure enough, the bishop is trapped. Now we have this pawn pushing, and, you know, Fischer thought, well, he can push forward here and try and free that bishop. So what does Spassky do? His king starts running towards the trapped bishop. The pawn presses forward, which is the best move. But now the king runs up here. Fischer tries to activate his own king, and the bishop is trapped pretty good here. So capture, capture. The bishop is given up. And let's look at the position after the dust settles here. Well, pawns are even on the queen side, but there's a 3 versus 1 majority. You know, material-wise, Spassky is ahead by the equivalent of a pawn. He has a bishop and a pawn versus 3. So the game continues with Fischer trying to get something going here. He's chasing these pawns. Pawns push up the board. Fischer activates his king. The bishop is moved to a more active diagonal here, where it can try and get up and behind these pawns. So Fischer immediately attacks here. We have a defensive move, protecting. Now, apparently this is the best move. You know, what other option could have been played? You know, according to the computer, it would have been better. Well, excuse me. The best move was a6, but you're probably wondering, well, what about this move? Well, if b6 were to be played, well, then it looks like you should just capture. And then, so I'll show you this real quick. So if this is played, you can just capture. Then after recapture, well, now you have a passed pawn making its way up. And the king would not be able to stop that, because if this pawn captures, then that one will march up before the king can get to it. You know, otherwise this pawn will move forward. So if you capture, well, then this one starts running and the king cannot stop that. So in the game, Fischer, you know, of course, plays the best move. And now we continue with the pawn pushing forward, getting closer to a promotion possibility. So the game continues with Fischer trying to trade off pawns after capture, capture. Fischer is fighting hard, but he's simply behind here. So the game continues with Fischer just moving back and forth. He's trying to get that pawn moving. Spassky brings his bishop up to cover this square, and prevent that pawn from promoting. So now we have a blocking move. Apparently, Fischer should have played g6 instead of that pawn push. So, let's see what the computer has in mind. g6, and then it looks like the best move would be king to h6. And what now? e4. Bishop could block, though. And it's not looking good for Fischer. So back to the finale of the game. We have a blocking move by the bishop. The king is protecting this pawn, but now the white king is heading over towards the other pawn. So Fischer tries to protect, but it's not looking good. An inaccuracy here by Fischer, but at this point he's simply behind. It looks like king to d6 might have been a little bit better. The other pawn jumps forward, is captured, and now Fischer is going to try and just knock out the other pawns and go for a draw. So he picks off this pawn, but this is where the game ended. So what could Fischer have done here? Well, he can't capture this pawn because of the bishop. So if he starts trying to run with this, well then the king can just go up to c7, protecting his pawn, freeing up this bishop to prevent the queening, and eventually he could try and knock this out. Let's play it out a little bit further and see how things could have gone. Let's see here. So back to where we left things. So if a4 is played, that is best. Now what? King up to c7, freeing up the bishop. And what do they recommend? Pushing that pawn. Oh, now it's saying that's an inaccuracy, that king to c4 would have been better, which that prevents the bishop from covering that square. So the problem is you could just capture this, and then that pawn can march up. So what's another option? Okay, after we push that, king attacks. The only other option is to protect this. But now what? Bishop centralizes. You don't want to move, so you have to start pushing this, and it would be hopeless. Anyway, before I drag the video on too long, and it's getting dark in here, turn on some light. Sad news that Boris Spassky passed away at 88 years old. If you're not familiar with Boris Spassky, the 10th world chess champion, take a look at some more of his games. Feel free to leave comments, like and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you, and have a super chess day.